In his inaugural address in 2016, Donald Trump talked, I think he used the phrase that if there's love for your country, if there's love for America, there's no room for hate. And Biden, I think, even more explicitly in his inaugural address, talked about the need for unity, the need for bringing everyone together. And this is very common. When someone wins a presidential election, honestly, when somebody loses a presidential election, it's pretty common for somebody to say, hey, it's time for us to all get together. Unity is something I think, broadly speaking, all Americans agree we need that. But you have a more nuanced understanding of what we mean by unity. So I'm wondering if we could start here. Can you unpackage for me? Well, yeah, Yuval Levin agrees we need unity, but what do we mean by unity?
Right. I think very often when those kind of politicians talk about unity, what they mean is something like agreement. If we all agreed, if everybody agreed with me, then there'd be no problems. And that makes sense. If everybody agreed with me, I'm pretty sure that things would be better in the country. I think everybody must think that. But that's not possible. And it's not really what unity means ultimately in a free society. The fact that we are a free society means that we can't all agree. That unanimity is not going to happen. Anybody who has ever had any experience getting together with a group of people knows that what happens in that group, however big or small it is disagreement. And the challenge for the political life of a free society is a different kind of challenge of unity, where unity means not thinking alike, but acting together. The question for us is how can we act together to address common problems, to take on common challenges when we don't think alike? And that question, how can we act together when we don't think alike, I think is the question that ultimately the American constitutional system exists to answer. There's a deep awareness on the part of the framers that unanimity is not possible. They're very explicit about this. James Madison, rather famously in Federalist 10, says, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. So differences are a necessary function of freedom itself. But that doesn't mean we can't be unified. And it doesn't mean that we can't act as a society to address common problems we have. And the question, how do we do that, is very often the question to which the Constitution arises as an answer. The answer it offers has to do with building coalitions, with negotiating through problems, with taking on challenges by allowing the different factions of our society to have their say and to be heard and to be part of the solution, and ultimately to facilitate various forms of accommodation. And the different institutions of the system are there above all to do that. They're grounded in that idea of unity, which I think is a more realistic one than the one we normally work with in our politics.
And if there's a central character in your book, I think it is James Madison, the individual who, in a lot of ways, is the archetype of the United States Constitution. You mention, and these are my words, kind of reflecting on yours, that you have your Alexander Hamilton concerned with social order, your Thomas Jefferson's concerned with social justice, but standing in between them here is this Madison type figure. So how does Madison enter into this equation? Because I think it's natural for us to put, say, your Hamilton's on the right, your Jefferson's on the left. Is Madison just this flaming moderate, or what is his contribution to the broader American project?
Yeah, the central character in the book certainly is James Madison. That's in part for me because what I'm trying to do in this book is to offer a more than lawyerly constitutionalism. Um, I think we've given the Constitution over to the lawyers much too much, and one of the things that stands out about James Madison among the intellectually significant framers is that he's not a lawyer. And he thinks about politics in a different way than even in the late 18th century lawyers tended to do. And part of what that means is that Madison's concern very often is with the foundational preconditions for a free society, foremost among which for him is something like social peace. Before you can have a working politics, you need to have the ability for people with very different views to engage with each other as fellow citizens. That doesn't mean he's a moderate, and Madison's not a moderate. He is a partisan very quickly in the constitutional system. Once it gets going, he's certainly a member of Jefferson's faction and an opponent of Hamilton's various ideas. Early on, he changes his views somewhat in the course of his career. By the end of his presidency, He can see some of the virtues of Hamilton's ideas. But at the time of the framing of the convention, what's distinct about Madison is that he's concerned about social cohesion. His worry is about faction. And we sort of know that, right? We identify him with the argument of Federalist 10 and all that. But what that really means is that Madison is concerned about the underlying preconditions for a political system in which the debate between Hamilton and Jefferson can happen. Before that can happen, before there's a left right, there has to be some framework for a divided and diverse people to engage with each other as fellow citizens. And Madison's concern very often is, how do we avoid this falling into civil war? How do we avoid this falling into social breakdown? He's much more concerned about the dangers that a democratic society faces. And he's worried about both the danger of democracy and the danger of oligarchy. He's worried about both the power of the people getting out of control and the power of an isolated elite destroying the freedom of the society. And for that reason, Madison is always looking for this balance between not only political extremes, but between just different factions. And the system seeks a balance in a way that I think is a distinct concern and interest of Madison's. And so, to the extent that what I'm looking at here is the way in which the Constitution can facilitate some greater cohesion by accommodating differences rather than by eliminating differences, my view of the Constitution is a very Madisonian view.
Being mindful first of that framework that allows the Hamiltons and the Jeffersons to have their debate is, I wouldn't say identical, but very similar, I suppose, to, in today's vernacular, the liberal right, the liberal left in a coalition versus the illiberal right and the illiberal left, right? Where it could be that the illiberal right and left have similar ends in minds, but that we disagree on what is the appropriate framework, and in weird ways, we find ourselves with more commonality with our progressive counterparts, say. And I want to read here a quote from your book. It says, "A politics that puts bargaining at its center assumes a broad base of moral legitimacy. It assumes that most political questions will not be fundamental questions of right or wrong, but prudential questions of better and worse. There are limits to that assumption, and therefore to a politics of negotiation. Some means and ends must be out of bounds in a politics of a decent society, and just which those are is a question that must itself be fought over time. But functional societies will only rarely encounter those boundaries and should want to avoid treating normal political questions as if they were fundamental or existential moral questions." This incidentally sounds very Burkean to me. This
Yes.
notion
Well, I
that
can't help that.
right, you can't help
I
that, right?
take it as a great compliment.
Right, but I'm curious here because I think one of the common critiques of Burkeanism, and one could even make of this statement, is, well, it sounds like what Yuval is arguing for is a morality of proceduralism. That at root there is nothing greater in our politics. There is no higher principle. There is nothing behind the structure or the form. And so I wanted to give you an opportunity here to express whether or not you would agree with that, or is there something much like Burke? I think that's often a criticism of his, is that
Yeah.
it's just proceduralism, and that in a sense there is, if there's no there, it's sort of a faulty foundation. So what would you say to that?
Yeah, I can see that critique, but I think it's wrong in two ways. I think it's wrong as a critique of this argument, and that it's wrong about proceduralism itself. I would say, first of all, that it's a mistake to think that the emphasis on facilitating social peace is a morally neutral emphasis. That emphasis actually begins from the moral premise that I think is the moral premise of our society, that's articulated in the Declaration of Independence, which is that we are all equal. If we are all equal, then we ultimately have to treat each other with dignity. And that means that we cannot prefer our political ends over the fundamental rights of our fellow citizens. That's the argument for a free society. And that's an argument for a politics that does not place my policy objectives above the fundamental legitimacy of my political opponent. That belief in equality is why there have to be constraints on political power. That belief in equality is why we have to have a system that is dominated by the rule of law. That is, as Michael Oakeshott would say, not telocratic, not driven by the policy ends, but nomocratic, that is governed by law. The rule of law is ultimately not a procedural thing. The rule of law is a function of our commitment to one another's equal dignity and worth. And that means that there have to be some frameworks, some rules, some constraints on what we do with power because our neighbor on the other side is also an equal human being. But I think there's an even deeper problem with the argument that somehow proceduralism is morally neutral, which is an argument you hear a lot from the right now. I think that's a very strange argument, and it's a particularly strange argument when it claims to come from a kind of classical moral foundation. That is when it claims to be an argument for some kind of Aristotelian or Thomistic way of thinking about morality. Moral formation in that very tradition, in the Aristotelian tradition, is a function of habituation in virtue, right? How do we become habituated in virtue? What is the means for doing that? The means for doing that is something like what these critics are calling proceduralism. That is, the rules of action that define a regime are actually absolutely fundamental moral teachers. There's no such thing as morally neutral proceduralism. Proceduralism says there is a limit on what you are allowed to do to your neighbor, and that limit is rooted in the belief that you have to treat your neighbor with dignity. That is a moral teaching. And it's not just a moral teaching, it's a way of habituating people in a kind of moral practice that ultimately turns us into liberal citizens in the deepest sense, people who actually believe in the underlying moral teachings of the liberal society, which have to do with the deepest kind of Jewish and Christian commitment to the equal dignity and worth of every human being. Proceduralism is not at all morally neutral. No proceduralism is morally neutral. Proceduralism teaches us by habit how to think in moral terms about the political life of our society, what it is that we can and should be doing. And so I think the very idea that proceduralism is somehow distinct from moral formation is wrong. And certainly the notion that a commitment to the rule of law is not rooted in moral foundations is not true. There's nothing neutral about any of that. Liberalism begins from a profound moral truth that is, to my mind, a Jewish and Christian truth above all, a kind of correction to classical philosophy. And I think liberal proceduralism is one of the great teachers of that essential moral corrective.
I want to get to a couple of critiques, say, of your argument from both the left and the right, maybe later in the conversation. But let's spend a little bit more time laying down some foundational thoughts here. Well, I guess first of all, maybe we should have started with this. What is your basic argument for the Constitution as this formative document that invites us towards unity?
Yeah, I came to write this book because we are living in a time when Americans clearly feel divided from each other. And when we have a sense that our society is coming apart a little bit, that our differences are very sharp and very intense. And I think that in a moment like that, we naturally look for ways to be more unified. Some of the frustration we have about contemporary political life is directed now from both the left and right at the Constitution. We tend to think that it's part of the problem, that it's part of what divides us, that it frustrates us, it doesn't allow majorities to have their way, it doesn't allow any change to happen. I think those critiques are actually fundamentally misguided about the nature of the Constitution. And that when we look for tools that might facilitate a more unified, more cohesive society, we should see the Constitution itself as first and foremost among those tools, and that it's intended to serve that purpose. When the Constitution describes its own purpose, the first thing it says is that it exists to form a more perfect union. That's not the only thing it says, it has other purposes too. All kinds of complicated needs of a self governing free society. But first and foremost, it says it's there to facilitate a more unified society. And I think you see that in the way that it works, that over and over it rises to meet political and policy challenges by, by facilitating coalition building, by bringing competing factions into competition and negotiation with each other, And so, by allowing us to live as a society that understands its fate as a common fate, that moves its citizens to speak of one another in the first person plural as we and us, the Constitution begins with that word, we. It speaks for one people. And I think it's very important for us to see that it offers us now various mechanisms of cohesion and unity that would serve us well. And that to the extent that we're failing to be unified, we certainly are living through a period of constitutional failure. But I think that failure is largely a failure of constitutional practice, which would be improved by becoming better acquainted with the Constitution itself. And that's the purpose of the book, to help people be better acquainted with the Constitution and also better acquainted with the idea of unity that underlies it. So the first chapter of this book is just called What is the Constitution? The last chapter is called What is Unity? And in a sense, the book tries to answer each of those questions by way of the other.
In Jay Cost's book, um, oh, good grief. I was going to call it The Great Debate. That's your book. The Price of Greatness. There we go. I think I was thrown
Yes.
off because his last name is Cost. I was going to call it The Cost of Greatness. The Price of Greatness was essentially a depiction of the arguments between Madison and Hamilton and kind of their different views here. I don't know that Madison ever used this term, but Cost uses the term attributed to Madison of the extended republic.
Yes.
And I note this in your book often, even though, and I'm not sure if you use that term either, but the idea there is behind it in that um, I almost get the sense that up until Madison, he had this rather innovative notion because it was just sort of taken for granted that look, if we're going to try a republic, it needs to be essentially a Greek city state, right? You can't get this thing too large or it falls apart. And it was Madison that came up with this idea. Like, well, wait a minute. What if it were even larger? Maybe we're thinking too small. So can you help unpackage for me what is this Madisonian, possibly innovative idea to a republic can actually endure if it's big enough?
Yeah, it's a very interesting concept, and it is a kind of innovation of Madison's. A lot of Madison's innovations are, I would say, extensions of insights that he gained from the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, and in some ways even from Aristotle. Some of these kinds of arguments are actually found in Book 4 of Aristotle's Politics too. But Madison develops this as an answer to what he takes to be, and what I think was, the most powerful critique of the Constitution from the Anti-Federalists. The argument they offered is that you can't really have a durable republic on a large scale, that a republic, to remain a republic and not devolve into an oligarchy or a tyranny, has to be relatively small, so that citizens engage each other directly, they know each other, and so that there is some common identity that helps them to hang together, and that ultimately gives each of them a stake in the life of that society. And that small republic argument was very challenging for Madison, because he does want to see the society that they're creating in the wake of the Revolutionary War as a republic. And it is important to him that it is what we would now call democratic in character. The confusion of these terms, democracy and republic, is a big problem for us in thinking about the Constitution. But what we mean by democracy, which is basically a representative democracy, is a lot of what Madison means by republic. But the other piece of what republic means, beyond being representative and democratic, is that in a republic, the citizens have some responsibility for the society. It's theirs, it belongs to them. They have obligations and duties to one another as citizens. And the Anti Federalists said this can only really work in a small society that shares in common a basic identity and some basic beliefs. And Madison wants to say the greatest threat that a republic faces is the threat of faction. That is, a portion of the society that uses politics to advance its own interest rather than the interest of the whole. And the solution to that problem is actually to enlarge the scope of the society so that there are not permanent, durable majority factions that can use the fact that they live in a democracy to permanently tyrannize and despotize minorities. The danger a democracy faces, the downside of majority rule, is majority despotism. And Madison says we avoid that by having a more complicated society, a bigger republic, in which everyone finds themselves in the minority sometimes, and therefore everyone has to worry about protecting minorities. He recognizes that majority rule is ultimately the only principle of legitimacy, but also that majority rule is dangerous. And I think anybody that looks at the history of democracy, anybody that looks at the history of the United States, has to see that that's true, that sometimes majorities are very dangerous to the rights of minorities. And Madison wants to avoid permanent majorities and minorities by allowing for a much more complicated society. And you do that by extending the scope of the republic, by making it bigger, by increasing the number of factions, so that majorities are coalitions rather than just permanent factions. And by having to form coalitions, they have to force themselves to think and speak in terms of the interest of the whole society and not just of their own little faction of it. It's a very novel argument. It's a very distinct argument. And it ultimately was a genuinely persuasive argument, not necessarily in Federalist 10, but in the debates at the convention. Madison makes this argument in response to the critique that becomes the anti-federalist critique. And it actually does, from what we can see anyway, have some persuasive power over some of the members who were unsure of what the character of this new system ought to be.
Was Madison's argument focused on factionalism as a concern as far as interest within the factions? In other words, hey, the concern here is that this faction is going to say, well, I can. What is that old phrase that a democracy fails once the majority realizes it can vote itself money, right? Then it can vote itself things that are in the best interest of the majority, but not necessarily the minority. Um, was that the primary concern, and did it anticipate the potential for ideological factional differences? In other words, as we often hear, it doesn't make sense that such and so votes for this candidate because that's against their interest. Well, yes, but it's within their ideological wheelhouse. So is this limited to this understanding of kind of an older form of factions or just trying to get what's theirs? Or does it also encompass this larger idea that we could have an ideological difference that could lead to a factionalism?
So Madison, as we find him on this question in Federalist 10, has a very sophisticated understanding of what faction can be. It does certainly begin in materialism. The strongest source of factions is economic interest for him, and this is true for Aristotle too. In this sense, he's really reflecting what we would find in Book 4 of Aristotle's Politics. The most significant and dangerous source of factions is economic interest, and Madison is focused on that above all. But he also sees ways, and for him, this begins particularly from concern about religious factions. He sees ways in which ideas, beliefs, commitments can be a source of factional differences that is not fundamentally economic. And he wants to think of these in similar terms so that we should have multiple factions, both in economic terms. You want a large republic so that it's not just farmers against merchants, it's not just city against country. The most dangerous number for Madison in politics is two. You don't want just two, you want more than two. And that can teach us something about the American party system, by the way, which we can talk about. But two is a dangerous number. And so you want a more complicated society so that you have to somehow be engaged in coalition building. And Madison is always, throughout his career, very alert to the danger of religious intolerance and religious domination. And so he certainly does think beyond merely economic factionalism. And he can see his way toward a certain kind of ideological factionalism. He becomes more sophisticated about this, I would say, later in his career as the nature of the parties really starts to take shape. But the logic that he begins with is materialist. It extends then into religion, and it certainly does build out into what we would think of now as ideological political factions. He thinks the solution looks similar on all those fronts.
I do very much want to talk about the political parties that you bring up in the book, but before we get too far ahead there, I was wondering if you could sketch for us if we let's take the issue of immigration, a very hotly contested issue. And I'm just wondering if you can give us sort of a framework for thinking of this as you're advocating with the Constitution as a bargaining formation or formative
Yeah.
institution. And I say that because I'm concerned sometimes those of us Americans who I don't know aren't 80 or older have lost the muscle memory of how this even works. You know,
Hmm.
there's an old onion video of senators sitting around who are debating. They cannot, for the life of them, remember how to pass a bill. And they're trying to figure out, well, what was how do we actually do this? And that was the whole
Yeah.
purpose of the video. Um, if I think of recent, the 1980s, of course, there's this famous bargain between the Reagan administration and Congress that led to amnesty in immigration. In more recent history, in the Bush administration, there's the infamous Gang of Eight, right? 8 senators, Democrats and Republicans, that came together to form a grand coalition of some sort of a bargaining chip for immigration. Maybe more recently, well, definitely more recently, my own Senator James Langford, attempted
Uh-huh.
to
Right.
extend the olive branch in some sense to the Biden administration, try to work out a deal there. Are there any of these, or maybe some others that I'm not thinking of, that serve possibly as a model, or maybe even as a jumping off point? What is wrong with these particular approaches that is the antithesis of what you're advocating?
Yeah, I think it's very important to see a couple of things here. So the counterintuitive insight at the core of the Constitution's approach to resolving deep differences is that the way to broaden majorities is to frustrate narrow majorities. The American system stands out from a lot of other democracies, from the parliamentary systems that prevail in most of the democratic world, in that it doesn't allow narrow majorities to exercise power. In the parliamentary systems, if you think about the Westminster system in Britain, even and even more so the continental European systems and the ones we find across Asia and some of Latin America, when you have a majority in parliament, you can basically do anything you want. And that majority can be very narrow, but if it's a majority, it has all the power of the system. The American system does not allow narrow majorities to get very far because we have cross cutting institutions, which means that in order to get anywhere, you need to have majorities in different institutions that are built up in different ways. We've also, over time, made it especially challenging to get majorities that are functional in the U.S. Senate. The filibuster is not in the Constitution, but I think it serves a very important constitutional purpose. And the idea is that in order to prevail, a majority should be broad and durable. That's a way to answer the challenge that Madison was confronting, the challenge that majorities can be oppressive. In order to avoid or minimize at least that challenge, you have to require majorities to build coalitions. Even though you won 51% of the vote, you still need some of the minority party with you in order to get somewhere. The American system insists on that in order to facilitate greater legitimacy. And that means that to address a problem like immigration, which is a very divisive problem in contemporary American society, you have to build a coalition that extends beyond the kinds of majorities that we now see elected in Congress and the kind of narrow majorities that now elect our presidents. We've lived for 30 years or so in America with 50-50 politics, where the House majority right now is a 3-seat majority in a House of Representatives with 435 members. Very, very narrow. The Senate majority is a 2-seat majority. The system intentionally makes it difficult for them to get anything done without getting some buy in from the other party. And that means that to achieve anything, you've got to make deals. You've got to reach across. You've got to build coalitions. You've got to give each side something so that it can agree to the other side getting something. Um, Immigration has been a particularly divisive issue in our politics because it's a kind of top bottom issue as well as a left right issue. And that means that you can't really get there with an elite left right majority or with a populist left right majority. You've got to bargain across all the lines of difference in our society. And we have lost some of the muscle memory for doing that. We have a tendency now in American political life, and I think this is one of the great failures of constitutional practice that make our politics difficult now. We have a tendency to see cross partisan bargaining as a failure, as a weakness, a failure of nerve. The primary system, which has been built on top of our party system, means that a lot of our politicians are accountable to voters who don't really want them to compromise and bargain, and to voters who value the dispute, the disagreement, the intense division more than they would value a policy outcome. And that is not a good fit for our constitutional system and makes it very hard to arrive at bargains and accommodations. I would say that if you look at the kind of legislation that's been enacted in, say, during the presidency of Joe Biden, what you find is that when bills do pass, when majorities are this narrow, they require some cross partisan bargaining. So we've seen modest but durable legislation, the CHIPS Act to fund research and development, the infrastructure bill that was passed, some modest reforms of the Electoral Count Act. Those are the kinds of things that get passed. They are bipartisan because of the filibuster in the Senate. They're going to last. But the kinds of things that the majority party right now, the Democrats, are trying to push, which are things like much more aggressive reforms of election law or laws on abortion and other things, they are not getting those through because the system is built to prevent narrow partisan majorities from getting their way. I think that's a strength of our system, but it's also very much a source of frustration. And coming to recognize that that frustration can be healthy because it would drive us to broaden coalitions is the hardest thing for us now. The knack for coalition building, both in Congress and in the political parties, is what we've really lost in 21st century American politics. And it's why I think we can learn from the Constitution about how to have a better politics. The system wants us to build coalitions.
You mentioned the parliamentary system, the Westminster, or honestly, the best of my knowledge, all democratic societies other than ours that have this sort of majoritarian model is that it does seem that that is at least where people, at least it's sort of an unstated frustration as well. The
Yeah.
majority ought to rule. Like we sort of want to pull in that direction. It makes sense that most free societies set up their system of government in that way. I am a firm believer, and evidently you are too, based on the book you've written and what I understand you've said in the past, that our system is superior, that our system is better at a true sense of unity or negotiation. And I'm just curious, this question maybe is a little disjointed from the rest of our conversation, but does that imply that the parliamentary systems of, say, France and the United Kingdom are lesser? Or is it a matter of the uniqueness of our history and complexity and
Yeah.
size that this system works the best for us? But those are completely legitimate systems that, like, in other words, would the United Kingdom be better off if they had a constitutional system like we do, or are they doing just fine under their parliament?
Well, let me give you a Burkean answer there, too. I think this system is best for us. I do think there are some ways in which it is inherently superior. There are also advantages to the parliamentary system, but the nature of the advantages and disadvantages of our system is best suited for us. The United States is actually very distinct from the European democracies because we are vast and very, very diverse, much more than they are. The oftentimes the critics of the Constitution will contrast us with, Norway or Belgium and say, look, these are much more representative systems, and that's true. But the very fact that we can even compare our politics to that of Norway or Belgium
Or
is
Hungary?
evidence to me, yeah, or Hungary, is evidence to me of how well our system works for us because that system masks from us just how different we are from those democracies. The United States is much more like India than it is like Norway. It is a vast, immense, diverse democracy. But the United States is much better governed than India, to the point where we can even imagine that maybe we should be trying these kinds of direct democracy reforms. We can't do that because we are so diverse that we have to work very hard at facilitating unity first before we can facilitate representation. And the American Constitution is very, very alert to that need and that challenge. It is aware of the fact that although majority rule is essential to legitimacy, majority rule is very dangerous to minorities. It's a fact that just does matter less in some of the European societies that are much smaller than we are, that are much more uh, i- internally cohesive than we are, that are just much less diverse than we are. Now, a lot of Europe is becoming more and more diverse now, and they're finding that their political systems don't work as well as they used to. I think they have some lessons to learn from us on that front, frankly. But it certainly seems to me that for our purposes, for the purposes of a society of 350 million people that is as intensely and immensely diverse as we are, our system does work better. And it was designed with that in mind. The United States, even in 1787, was larger than any of the European nations and was unusually diverse already. It is much more so now. And so I think the strengths that our system has, the distinctions, the differences that it has, many of them have a lot to do with this need to simultaneously balance majority rule and minority rights and allow for a representative system that facilitates effective policymaking and governance. That's a very, very difficult balance to sustain. And a lot of what's most mysterious, most frustrating about our system, these weird mechanisms, like the way the Senate is elected, like the way the president is elected, which are bizarre, which are complicated, which are much more complex than direct democracy. A lot of them have to do with the need to balance the importance of majority rule with the dangers of majority power, and the American system pays more attention to that than any other system. So that I think in a society where that's a particular problem, this kind of system does work better, would work better. And I think for us, to me, there's no question that this kind of system is better fitted to the American situation than a parliamentary system would be.
So part of that system, you mentioned this already, the electoral college. I mean, we're in an election year.
Mhm.
Depending on how close it is and how things work out, we may in fact endure yet another debate about should we even have this. I do think it's, and I've got my history a little wrong here, I think, but I want to say that the popular vote has not gone to the winner on four separate occasions in United States history, and
That's right.
two of those four happened within living memory, which is insane. It's just the way that the map kind of works. So I don't think we're living in a normal era. I think this is,
Yeah.
but I'm bringing this up because I think even those who defend and those who oppose the Electoral College, I presume would all agree. Look, it didn't exactly evolve as originally intended. As far as like the electors having these multiple votes, the first guy becomes president, the guy who gets the runner up becomes vice president, which was a
Hmm.
terrible idea to begin with, but it took us a while to figure that out. It didn't work as intended because it didn't anticipate the advent of the partisan political party, that in effect we're electing electors who are themselves partisans and going to vote for, uh, virtual guarantee they would vote for the party they were elected to,
Yeah.
or rather representative of. And so I'm curious because those of us who would advocate the benefits of electoral college, I think I'm wondering what is the proper way of thinking of this? Is it a happy accident that it evolved the way it did, not necessarily originally intended, to work within a constitutional framework? Or was there something more intentional going on in the background?
I think there's a little bit of both going on. So, the Electoral College was intended in large part to address a problem that every democracy has to worry about, which is that the direct election of a chief executive runs a very grave risk of putting demagogues in the position of the chief executive. The parliamentary systems are aware of this too. The way they choose the chief executive is actually much less democratic than ours. It's less democratic, not more, than the Electoral College. If you think about the British, for example, the classic model of a parliamentary system, the British just had an election. They have a new prime minister. The previous election was 4.5 years earlier. And in the course of those 4.5 years, they had three different prime ministers.
Hmm.
So who chose those people? Well, they were chosen by a majority of the majority party in parliament. They were chosen by about 260 people, all of whom have the same political interest, most of whom went to the same two universities. That's a much less representative system than the Electoral College, but it exists to solve the same kind of problem, which is you don't want a direct, simple democratic election of the chief executive because that creates an opening for demagogues to move the public. And so the American system does this by having, by now, since we have 50 states, 50 separate popular elections, the results of which are then weighted by population. That's not exactly how it was originally intended. The Electoral College was thought by the framers to offer the potential for some actual deliberation in the selection of the chief executive. The idea was that the electors would be important people in their states, and they would actually talk to each other about who should we be be choosing for president. That never happened. It never happened at all. Even in the election of George Washington, it never happened. And right away, the electors began to become a kind of rubber stamp for the electors, for the popular vote in their state. So almost from the very beginning, that's what's happened. But the system does give us a little bit of distance between the direct election and the ultimate selection of the chief executive, and it offers us some advantages that were not really thought about originally. Advantages that are especially valuable in a time like this when the country is very divided. So the Electoral College tends to magnify popular majorities. So if you have a small popular majority, you generally will have a large Electoral College majority because of the nature of the division of the population. But maybe more importantly for us, the Electoral College focuses our presidential elections on the ideological middle of the electorate. If we had a direct election of the president, just direct democracy, the parties would focus on the parts of the country where they were strongest, where they could get the most people out to vote. Democrats would really run in California, and Republicans would really run in the Deep South, and they would hope that they get enough people out to offset the other party. They wouldn't really have to talk to each other. They would have to talk to their most devoted voters. In this political moment, that's the kind of thing that would likely happen. But as it is, because of the Electoral College, you can win by as big a margin as you want in California or in Texas. If you didn't win Michigan, if you didn't win Georgia, you didn't win the election. And what it takes to win in those states is you have to appeal to voters who could go either way, which means that both parties have to talk about the issues they're least comfortable with. Both parties have to reach for those potential swing voters, even when there are very, very few such voters in our country. And the system forces the election to be focused on them. That was not an argument made for the Electoral College by the framers of the Constitution. I don't think they saw that potential, but we should see that potential. And in thinking about the various alternatives that people propose to the Electoral College, I think it's very important to see that those kinds of direct democracy, the simple popular vote, would tend to magnify our divisions in a moment like this rather than mitigating those divisions. So I certainly am a defender of the Electoral College. We've had, as you say, 4 instances when the popular vote was different in outcome from the Electoral College vote. I think there are a couple of important things to understand about this. 2 of those have happened, as you say, in the 21st century, in this moment when we live in a 50-50 politics. The other 2 happened at the end of the 19th century, in a very similar period, the only similar period we've lived through, where for more than a decade, there was no majority party in the American system. There were 50-50 elections, power kept swinging back and forth. That period at the end of the 19th century was the only other time when that's happened. We've now lived through something like 30 years like that, where we've had really no majority party in American life. But I think, secondly, it's a mistake to say that that means that there was a popular majority for the person who didn't win the election. What we see with the popular vote in an election where what's actually up for grabs is the Electoral College is not the same thing we would see in a popular vote where the president was directly elected. It's just simply the case that because our elections ultimately hinge on the Electoral College, candidates run in a particular way, the parties think about their job in a particular way, and the popular vote in that election doesn't tell us the same thing that the popular vote would tell us in a direct election of the president. So it's very hard to say exactly where we'd end up. The closest thing we have to a national popular vote is the popular vote for the House of Representatives, where if you look at the overall popular vote for the House, that's something like what an election between the parties would look like on a national scale. And the problem for opponents of the Electoral College is that in modern America, the House majority is actually very often determined in New York and California. That's been true for most of the 21st century. We don't think of it that way because those are not competitive states, but there's states where there are a lot of people in both parties. And oftentimes, when the House majority is narrow, it actually hinges on Republican districts in New York State, on Republican districts in Orange County, California. I don't think we want a presidential election that is determined in New York and California. And I think that the system we have is better than the usual alternative. I certainly would not say that it's ideal. I certainly would not say that it works exactly as intended. But when you consider a political reform, you always have to ask yourself, compared to what? And compared to the kinds of alternatives that are offered, I'm very much a defender of the Electoral College.
There is obviously a lot more we could say about the Electoral College, but I think it anticipates very nicely what I'd mentioned. I do want to talk about political parties
Yeah.
because I think there's a similar vein there. And if there's a the central character in your book, James Madison, I think there at the end, the surprise appearance character at the end is Martin Van Buren, right?
Mm.
Who makes kind of a late appearance but a very important contribution. A man who is unfortunately almost more of a trivia question
Yeah.
these days, less familiar to us. The vice president, of course, of Andrew Jackson, later president. Someone
Right.
who, an imperfect figure, of course, his treatment of Native Americans is not exactly laudable, but was nonetheless very important in the shaping of the American political party. So I'm wondering, can you introduce to us how did because in a lot of ways you're introducing Van Buren as this individual who completes the missing puzzle in the constitutional system in
Yeah.
his insights and innovations about the American party system.
Yeah, the American party system is a peculiar thing. The framers of the Constitution hoped to avoid it. They hoped not to have permanent, durable political parties. But very, very quickly, as soon as the system got going, there emerged these more or less durable political parties. And very early on, there were just two of them. The reason for that actually has to do with what we were just talking about, the Electoral College. Because the rules of the Electoral College requires you to win an absolute majority of electors to be elected president, that fact means that if there are more than two serious competitors for president, the election is likely to go to the House. No one will win a majority, and the House of Representatives would choose the president. That's happened twice in our history, in 1800 and 1824. And in both cases, it led to really serious legitimacy crises. It was something to be avoided. So that from very early on, the political system sought to have two serious contenders for the presidency and therefore basically two political parties. And for most of our history, we've had more or less two political parties. The logic of those parties as two broad coalitional camps, that is, the parties don't represent narrow constituencies in American life that fight for election and then whatever number of seats they get, they then build coalitions to have a parliamentary majority, the way it works in Britain and in most of the democratic world. Instead, our parties are themselves broad coalitions. They do differ from each other in ways that are ideological, that in some ways are regional, that in some ways are economic, but they're also broad coalitions so that the work of party building itself is coalitional work. And in that sense, I think it really suits people to work in the political system, which requires a lot of coalition building. I think it's a good fit for our constitutional system. And in a sense, a kind of missing piece of the puzzle in that system. And the logic of that kind of two party system really emerged from one of those two elections where the choice of the presidency went to the House. The 1824 election was very, very messy. There were four candidates, they were all Democrats: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. They were all serious national figures. And none of them won a majority. None of them came close to winning a majority of the Electoral College. So the election went to the House. The House chose John Quincy Adams, who had come in second both in the Electoral College and in the popular vote. It was a disaster. And as the House was working to choose the president, sitting in the gallery was a senator from New York, Martin Van Buren. The Senate didn't have anything to do in that period because actually the two leading candidates had the same vice presidential candidate. They had the same person on the ticket with them. So that person got elected vice president, and senators were sitting there watching the House choose the president. And Martin Van Buren thought to himself, this should not be happening in the House of Representatives. This should be happening within a political party. And he proposed in the wake of that a set of party institutions like conventions, like local party committees that would choose candidates, that would do the work of candidate selection. That's an essential piece of what parties do, and would therefore facilitate the work of the constitutional system by building coalitions in ways that would then allow for the election of coalition building politicians to work within the system in Congress and the presidency, and all the way down into state and local offices. Um, that system is also distinct. The United States is almost unique in the world for having essentially a two party political system, and for having these kinds of broad coalitional parties. And I think it's very important that the parties work this way. And I would say one of the ways in which our system has fallen out of whack is that the party system has given up that fundamental role that Martin Van Buren saw as essential to it, which is candidate selection. Since the middle of the 20th century, both parties have ceded candidate selection to the primary system, to what are really essentially random electorates, the people who happen to show up on primary day to choose candidates to run for office. These are, generally speaking, the most partisan members of the two parties. They're, generally speaking, the least coalition minded and the least compromise minded of the members of the two parties. And because we begin every election cycle by asking those most partisan Americans, what do you want to see? We've ended up with the system being populated by politicians who are very partisan and also not inclined toward coalition building and negotiation. So I think the recovery of the constitutional system really requires something of a recovery of the party system. And that too requires a reacquaintance with the logic of both the party system and the constitutional system. I think they're very similar logics. Martin Van Buren is a Madisonian figure.
Here at Saving Elephants, there's a lot of recurring villains, I guess, if you will, in the narratives. Robespierre or Rousseau or Karl Marx, certainly. One of them that's recurring very often is Woodrow Wilson, who also makes an appearance
Mhm.
here toward the end, very much in line with what you're talking about, that he was in a lot of ways responsible for the modern political party as we understand it today. And you write in the book here, it says, our increasingly Wilsonian party system is poorly aligned with the Madisonian constitutional system. That misalignment leads political partisans to view our governing institutions as hopelessly unsuited to their ends and, therefore, to approach those institutions with hostility and invest their hopes in various end runs around them. But durable political change in our country happens through the institutions of our system, not around them. And I think in a lot of ways, this sort of this is a nice wrap up, say, of your basic argument that look, we have a constitutional system we really need to be reintroducing ourselves to, and yet we have a party system that sees itself as antagonistic against that system. That it's frustrated by it. It wants to reform the system, but its idea of reform is to air quotes make it work by misunderstanding what Madison had laid out in the first place. So it really sounds to me like you're advocating almost simultaneous reformations of a reacquaintance, say, of our constitutional system, but also a reformation of our political parties to work within that system.
Absolutely. I think the two have to work together. And the fact is, Woodrow Wilson thought they had to work together too. And the reason for his emphasis on parties was that changing the parties was somewhat easier than changing the constitutional system, but was a way to drive the same change in that constitutional system. Wilson wanted a system that was more responsive to ideologically coherent public pressure. He wanted essentially accountable parties so that the two parties would each offer a program, a coherent program to the public. On election day, the public would choose between them, and that was the decisive moment in American government. Once that choice was made, then the party that won would have all the power in the system to make the change it wanted to make and pursue the agenda it wanted to pursue. That is not a crazy way to think about government. That is how the parliamentary systems work. I think it is democratically legitimate. I think it is not a good fit, as we've said, for American life. And it is a rejection wholesale of the Madisonian logic of the constitutional system. In the American system, when you win an election, you don't win a mandate to govern unimpeded until the next election. You win a seat at the table. And what happens at the table is bargaining and negotiation and accommodation between people who all won seats at the table. That was very, very frustrating to Woodrow Wilson. It's remained very, very frustrating to many progressive critics of the Constitution because I think they underestimate the danger of unconstrained majority rule. They underestimate the danger of social division and of social breakdown in American public life. And so they underestimate the importance of the kind of unity and cohesion that the Constitution makes possible, which is a negotiated unity and cohesion. And that Wilsonian logic has absolutely worked its way through first the party system, especially with the implementation of primaries. Wilson was not originally actually a champion of primaries, but he came to be for exactly this reason that it can drive change in the larger political system in the direction of a more centralized and ideologically coherent kind of politics. We've seen that change happen in Congress, for example. The centralization of power and leadership is exactly a move in the direction of a Westminster system. The Speaker of the House has become more and more like a kind of prime minister, and that's been driven by both parties. It definitely came from the Democrats in the 1970s, but I think the most Wilsonian figure in the history of the modern Congress was actually Newt Gingrich, who was
Mm.
a Republican Speaker of the House, but centralized power and made the institution less capable of internal cross partisan bargaining and negotiation in an effort to make it more accountable to the majorities that elect it. I think that is a failure of acquaintance with the Madisonian logic of the Constitution, and we do require some reacquaintance with that logic.
Your explanation of what Wilson was up to is more charitable than what Jonah Goldberg would possibly say, but nonetheless accurate.
Yeah. Look, I take Wilson seriously. He's an
Yeah,
impressive figure. He was a great political scientist, and it's very unusual for a political scientist to then also become a political leader, as he
yes.
did. But I think he was profoundly wrong about what America needed and what the strengths and weaknesses of our system were. And I think he's ended up doing a lot of damage to that system.
There are a ton of things I would love to ask you. I wanted to close those since we're running low on time. I mentioned possibly your critics on the right say I have a good friend, very intelligent, very steeped in politics. He had listened not about the book, but an interview he'd given for Persuasion.
Hmm.
And he said, enjoyed it. There's a lot of good things in there. And he sent me this message, said, a lot of good stuff in this interview and very good diagnosis and prescriptions for future candidates. But one flaw, and that is not addressed at the end, it doesn't address that the cultural left will not leave us alone. Maybe I missed it, but it doesn't address that part of institutional capture and how to combat destruction, except for destruction is bad, and that we need to fight for institutions. Maybe I'm just not seeing it. And this I think is a common critique of your work throughout all of
Sure.
your work, right? That you're standing outside of this larger moment. Hey, we're at war with the cultural left, and here this guy Yuval is just talking about how we need to reacquaint ourselves with the systems and ignoring the fact that there's a war going on out here. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to kind of
Yeah.
address that broader criticism of your overall work.
So part of what it means to say that I'm a conservative is that I don't think that the fundamental challenge of this moment is different than the challenge we always face. The challenge we always face is how can we raise another generation of Americans who are formed and steeped in the right ways to be free citizens of a free society and who can live in a way that is rooted in the best traditions of our civilization. The moral traditions that I take to be especially rooted in Judaism and Christianity, the political traditions that come to us from Rome and Athens through through the improvements made possible by the American constitutional system, and that have allowed us to be and to live as citizens of the greatest republic in the history of the world. That challenge is always our challenge. And a conservatism that begins by saying, life was easy for our grandfathers, but now we have big problems, is wrong. Life was not easy for our grandfathers. They had really big problems, and their problems were not fundamentally different from ours. They were different in some important circumstantial ways. We have to see the character of the present challenge we face, the nature of today's left, and how it challenges us. But the idea that things used to be easy, now the left has won every fight, and therefore we face a situation that is too dire for us to make use of the traditional tools that are at our disposal is, I think, a mistake. It's a form of escapism. It's a way to avoid the hard work of conservation and preservation. It's a way to say the tools that used to be effective are no longer effective because now the left is really bad. Well, I'm just not that impressed with the 21st century left. I do not think they have won everything. I do not think they are all that persuasive to the public. I think most people see them as crazy, and we don't beat them because most people see us as crazy too. And we are pretty crazy. And that the way to ultimately win and the way to both wrestle control of some of the core institutions that matter most to us, like the university and cultural institutions and corporations and schools, and the way to win politically is to recur to the fundamental truths that we stand for as Americans and to restore and recover the logic of the kind of politics that can make possible the continuation and the preservation of this republic. That means that the answer to, what time is always basically the same. It's time to do the fundamental work that's required of us as citizens of the United States. And to understand that work, we have to know our system, we have to know the Constitution, we have to know our history, and we have to grasp the core moral truths that underlie it. So there's a lot of fighting to be done. The today's cultural left is very dangerous to the future of the country. The question is not whether they have to be fought at every turn they do. The question is how. And I think the answer to that question does not change with every generation. The answer to that question does not change because there's Twitter now, or because the particular kinds of institutional fights we have to have are different in every moment. The fundamental character of the answer to that question is the same, and it requires us to make sure our children know our traditions, to make sure that we're living up to those traditions, and to make sure that we fight in the right way. The image that's always in my mind for the fights that we have to have is an image that comes from the biblical book of Nehemiah. People don't often read Nehemiah. It's at the very end of the Hebrew Bible. He was charged with rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem after the exiles returned from Babylon. And he sent his men up to the wall because they were under constant assault. He sent them up with a trowel in one hand to build the wall and a spear in the other hand to fight the fight. That's our job. We cannot forget the trowel. We cannot forget that we are building and rebuilding core institutions. And we cannot forget the spear. We can't forget that we have to be fighting our way to be able to do that building. But the fighting cannot overcome the building cannot overcome the fighting. We can't ignore the problems we have and the challenges we face and the opponents we face. And we can't ignore the fact that the core work is the core of building and sustaining institutions. I think we run the risk now of letting the fighting cause us to forget the building. And for that reason, I work to try to remind people of the building, not to the exclusion of the fighting, but I certainly emphasize the building and lean very hard in that direction. The reason is that we risk forgetting that right now. This is a particular moment when we risk forgetting that above everything. And so I think it's a moment to emphasize the essential work of sustaining our institutions, even if I do it to the extent that it sounds like I'm not worried about the fighting. I sure am. But what we're forgetting now is the building, and that is absolutely crucial.
Hmm. The name of the book, American Covenant, how the get in the screen there, how the Constitution unified our nation and could do it again. Yuval Levin, it is always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show.
Thank you very much.